Here's
Oh, thank you. Are you just going to share? Oh, yeah. And we're going to get started in just a moment. Thank you guys and welcome to the Social Justice Research Symposium. This is our third session today, and we will have some student presenters starting off. I believe our first student presenter is Claire. Just give me one moment to actually pull up. Not yet. And oh, Dr. Zuberi, and then I will take it over. Leave the shipping.
All right, thank you everybody for joining us today on day 3 of the Social Justice Research and Scholarship Symposium. We're really excited. We have a full panel today, all focused on local justice. And so we're going to hear from students from multiple disciplines, which I think is pretty exciting, who are all talking about issues of social justice. We're going to cover topics of food insecurity, gentrification and homelessness, poverty and how that impacts suicide, privilege and intersectionality. And we're also going to hear about the Elsinore Bennu think tank and their focus on restorative justice. Students who are presenting come from multiple disciplines, as I said, from history, from political science, but also from schools outside of liberal arts. So we have forensic science and law, and we also have biology and pre-med represented. So I think it's a really exciting day to bring together all of these different lenses and to talk about social justice. So without further ado, I think we will go ahead and get started. And just some ground rules. We have 15 minutes per speaker. So I'll keep an eye on the time and wave at you when we hit our limit. But please just try and stay within that time so that we have a little bit of time at the end for discussion. All right, so we're going to start off today with Claire Kreider, and she's going to speak to us about the subsistence of climate-induced food insecurity in pre-revolutionary.
Thank you all. In 1788, Jacques Necker, finance minister for Louis XVI, wrote, "The subsistence of the people is the most essential object that must occupy the administration." This statement was founded on the uncontested policy convention that the French government had, that social stability could only be maintained by guaranteeing a stable supply of grain and cereal. In my paper, I argued that in pre-revolutionary France, extreme weather episodes resulted in food insecurity and increased the political and economic instability in an already volatile and vulnerable state. These factors destabilized the country and helped the middle class overthrow the existing regime, thus commencing the French Revolution. To better understand the scope of these weather events and food insecurity, we must first examine the pre-existing economic conditions in pre-revolutionary France. On the eve of the French Revolution, the French economy was in a dire state. Years of war, overspending, ineffective taxation, and feudal privileges left the country in loads of debt and placed most of the economic burden on France's poorest class, the sans-culottes. 95% of the sans-culottes diets consisted of bread and cereals, and because such a large portion of their diets came from these grain products, they were extremely susceptible to the effects of weather, pests, and crop disease. To make matters worse, France experienced a bizarre series of weather events in 1788 and 1789, probably the result of a volcanic explosion in Iceland earlier in the decade, which spewed ash, dust, and sulfur into the atmosphere, significantly lowering the temperatures in France and the rest of Western Europe. Additionally, there was a low-yield famine following the extreme weather events in 1788 and 1789. When this occurred, grain prices skyrocketed. After this inflation, the poor can now expect to spend at least 85% of their wages on bread alone. Bread riots began to break out in August of 1788. Although at this time, these riots were largely the result of famine and did not carry any anti-regime overtones. After the Estates General met in May, however, anti-regime overtones soon filled in bread riots and public protests. In October, I had the opportunity through the Vardy International Research Grant to travel to London and conduct research at the British Library. Here I studied British, Irish, and Scottish periodicals from the months prior to and 3 years after the French Revolution. I found commentary on the revolutionary events in France, details of violence and protest, and parliamentary debates on whether or not Britain should send humanitarian aid to France. Although this research is still ongoing, I'm pleased to share some of my findings with you later today. I also studied meteorological observations collected by French scientists, the Paris Astronomical Observatory, and the newly published weather journals from Thomas Jefferson. I also analyzed grape harvest data. Late harvest dates are indicative of a vine growth period during which temperatures were mostly cold, whereas early harvest dates suggest relatively high temperatures during the same seasonal interviews. I also examined diaries, diplomatic dispatches, and official correspondences collected by American, French, and British statesmen. So with that being said, let's hop to France in 1788. France experienced high atmospheric surface pressure in the spring of 1788. The data suggests that France was under an anticyclonic circulation, not conducive to precipitation formation. These conditions account for the low rainfall and high temperatures in Paris and the surrounding regions. France also experienced a hailstorm on July 13, 1788, that covered a large portion of central France and destroyed vineyards, wheat fields, livestock, and property with hailstones 16 inches in circumference. The western province of France also experienced a hailstorm in May and was in no position to recover from the later July storm. And examining the average deviations of rainfall for the months of April through May for the years 1781 to 1790 in Paris, the data indicates that in 1788, Paris experienced a 10% rainfall deficit. Other nearby areas experienced rainfall deficits of 35%, and southern provinces experienced rainfall deficits of 85%. It's important to note here that adverse weather does not have to be nationwide to affect an entire nation's food supply. In the spring and summer of 1788, temperatures averaged between 89 and 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Typically in April through June, temperatures range between 46 and 74 degrees Fahrenheit in France. This data suggests that low rainfall was aggravated by high temperatures and evapotranspiration, causing young crops to wither in the heat, thus resulting in harvest failure. The winter of 1788 and 1789 was particularly severe due to its duration. Paris saw 86 days where temperatures sank below freezing. In examining data recorded at the Paris Astronomical Observatory, the coldest temperature to occur was -7 degrees Fahrenheit. The average winter temperatures in France range between 32 and 46 degrees Fahrenheit. In the spring, the thawing of rivers and streams caused waters to rise, flooding wheat fields and pastures and bursting through rudimentary retaining dikes. When crops fail or yields are lower than expected, less food reaches the market, and this increase in demand causes prices to rise. The data suggests that the wheat harvest of 1788 amounted to 7/12 the average, and the buckwheat, barley, and oat harvest amounted to 2/3 the average. Additionally, the quantitative shortfall of the grain harvest was amplified by the low quality of the crops themselves. It's commonly suggested that popular disturbances coincide with periods of high bread prices. In the case for pre-revolutionary France, this proves to be true. The price of wheat and rye at the beginning of 1787 was only slightly higher than the price of wheat and rye at the beginning of 1786. There's a notable rise in March of 1788, anticipation of a poor harvest, and this rise grew steeper in June, and by July of 1789, the prices were 50% higher than what they had been the previous year. The highest price of bread occurred on July 14th, 1789, the day the Bastille was stormed. France periodically experienced bread riots throughout the 17th and 18th century. Owing to the dearth of grains, bread riots would usually break out in the late winter or early spring. However, the harvest failure of 1788 was so severe that the first bread riot broke out in August of 1788. It became obvious by March of 1789 that that year's harvest would be inadequate, and therefore, as the price of grain rose, so did the number and degree of violent protests. Accordingly, 300 riots broke out all over France during the months of April through July of 1789. Until the spring of 1789, the bread riots across France generally lacked any anti-regime overtones. Until the meeting of the Estates General, almost all riots were exclusively a consequence of crop failure caused price increases of bread. The anti-regime overtone was further solidified on June 17, 1789, when the Third Estate reconditioned themselves as the National Assembly. After the meeting of the Estates General, these disturbances assumed the political message, and because the poor had no real political leadership, the bourgeoisie found an opening and organized the urban poor under a united call for affordable bread, the abolishment of feudal dues, and the easing of taxes. In late June of 1789, France submitted a request to Britain for 20,000 sacks of flour to alleviate hunger in France. Debates soon filled Parliament as British officials debated whether or not Britain should send aid to France. Some politicians believed that sending aid to France would place Britain in danger because the kingdom frequently experienced its own bouts of food insecurity, while others supported sending aid to France because it was the right thing to do. However, both sides were worried about what French food insecurity meant for Britain's own food security and that of her colonies. Britain decided to send aid to France only if there had been a plentiful harvest and effectively placed a ban on all exports to France. It would be another 2 years before grain in Britain was legally exported to France. Merchants caught smuggling grain to France would be fined and arrested. However, the United States and Ireland sent flour to France in the months following the storming of the Bastille, which helped lower the cost of flour in France. By examining British debates of whether or not the UK should send France aid, we learned a lot about our own sentiments towards those experiencing food insecurity and what we are willing to do to combat them. These debates can be had at the personal, local, national, and global levels. So that brings us to today in Pittsburgh. According to the Department of City Planning, 21.4%, or 1 in 5 Pittsburghers, are food insecure. This is higher than both the national average of 12.3% and the county average of 14%. Most of the food insecurity in Pittsburgh is found within the city's Black and Brown communities, such as the Hill District, Homewood, and Edgewood. Organizations such as Big Lou's Big Idea Team, Just Harvest, Greater Pittsburgh Community Food Bank, and the 412 Food Rescue have worked tirelessly to ease food insecurity in the city. But food insecurity does not exist in a vacuum. There is always something that leads to it. Even before COVID-19, reduced incomes, disrupted supply chains, and chronic and acute global hunger were on the rise due to various factors, including civil conflict, socioeconomic conditions, and climate change. To make matters worse, the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization estimates that the global population will surpass 9.1 billion people by 2050, at which point the agricultural systems will not be able to supply enough food to satiate the world. As climate change continues to worsen, this timeline is sped up even more. Food insecurity is just one of the many microaggressions and acts of slow violence committed against Black and Brown people, returned citizens, and those living in poverty. Food insecurity threatens the stability of populations everywhere, and to remedy food insecurity amongst the most vulnerable groups, just like the sans-culottes in pre-revolutionary France, we must first get to the root of the problem. So, where do we start? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think we're going to hold questions until the end. Is that right?
We could take questions right now. Does anyone have any questions at the moment? I just want to ask, what led you to making like these causal connections to like Pittsburgh? What actually initiated this project for you?
Sure. I started this research in my undergraduate degree at Point Park University. I majored in political science with a concentration on international relations in the Middle East. And while I was learning about the Arab Spring, I saw a lot of connections between those protests and the French Revolution. And then I grew up in an area where 43% of the county is at or below poverty line. And because so many people in our county qualify for free lunch at school, the entire school qualifies. So I think it's just a variety of factors. And then last year we saw the increase of food insecurity with COVID-19. And I think recently we've seen talks of food insecurity and national political agendas, which I think is a great start. Thank you.
Have any other questions?
I'll add one.
Okay. What do you have any advice for like people who are watching this and like want to take some kind of action or get involved in some way? Like how can we make an impact or what can we do?
I think there are a ton of great local organizations that do help distribute food, but I think real change will have to occur at the state and national policy level, regardless of how hard individuals work. It really comes down to federal funding and bridging the growing income gap and access to affordable healthcare and education. Food insecurity doesn't exist on itself.
I just have a comment, not necessarily a question. I think your presentation is great. I think it's really interesting how you linked both of those and your previous research. It's super cool that you were able to do that. But I also think it's super interesting looking at like the social determinants of health and federal funding and stuff like that, and how maybe people in the medical profession can prescribe like a healthy diet, because you can tell patients or people that you see like, oh, eat your fruits and vegetables. We can have federal campaigns to say, oh, you need this much milk and this much dairy and this much meat and cheese or whatever in your diet, but it's so hard for people to actually enact that. So I think that's interesting. And I agree with you on the federal level that things really need to change, but
yeah,
it's hard to do that.
Yeah, I think too, especially up until recently, there really hasn't been a lot of inclusion of fresh produce and meat and dairy in food distribution. And I know Just Harvest and other local organizations have prioritized produce. But for a while, we've kind of left those vulnerable eat what we would deem like unhealthy food, and that goes into their health and then the limits that then causes.
All right.
I said a quick source question. I know the research is ongoing. Can you talk a little bit about access to this new international source basis, shifting where this project might go?
Sure. I would really like to look into food insecurity in Britain. Because like I said, Britain decided to not send aid to France. And once the United States and Ireland sent flour exports to France, the price of flour in France declined, but then the price of flour in Britain rose. And you see a lot of cases of food insecurity in Britain. I came across this one excerpt of people in London eating dogs with rabies, and then humans would get rabies because there was such little food that they were forced to go to desperate means that ultimately cost them their life.
All right, so in the interest of time, we're going to move on to the next one, but
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So next we are going to hear from Jason Minicozzi, so if you want to come on up, and he is going to present on a talk titled "No Human is Illegal: The Study of Hostile Architecture and Gentrification in Pittsburgh."
Sorry, just give me 1 second.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jason Minicozzi. I'm a sophomore in the graduating class of 2024, and my research is on the study of hostile and anti-homeless architecture in Pittsburgh. So this is a pretty niche topic. A lot of people wonder what this even is and how I came upon it. So just a little bit of a backstory. I was a very privileged child. I never experienced a lot of homelessness when I grew up. And when I moved to Duquesne, because I'm a transfer here, I saw a lot of injustices being committed against the homeless population, and I knew I had to do something about it. So I started my research, and I came upon this bench, and it's just a normal bench, but it has an armbar in the middle of it. So what this armbar does is it turns this normal bench into an anti-sleep bench. And what this does is it prevents homeless people or the general public from acting leisurely on this bench, and you can't lay down, you can't get comfortable. And it's all because of this armbar. So I had to do more research, and this led to today's presentation. So the homeless epidemic. Across the US, there's approximately 500,000 homeless people. And this is not just a number, these are actual lives. It could be the person sitting next to you. It could be someone you went to school with. It could be anybody. So these are actual lives that are being impacted by this anti-homeless architecture. Looking closer at Pittsburgh, there's approximately 11,000 people each year that are affected by homelessness. And again, these can be anybody. So homelessness extends further than just the person on the street that you see begging for money. Okay, this can be anybody. This is the breakdown of the country population along with the racial disparity of it. And you can see at the bottom, there's the unsheltered. The emergency shelter is long-term housing. The safe haven is more temporary. So you'll see me mention this a lot. This is like a day shelter or a night shelter that you would go to if you're seeking shelter. And then obviously you have the unsheltered, and then you can see the disparity between races in the homelessness epidemic, although it is a little bit cut off, but you get the gist of it. Moving on, homelessness is not always homelessness. I briefly touched about this before, how homelessness can be anyone. So this impacts everyone, not just the homeless. So this architecture is impacting, it could be a pregnant woman if she gets a dizzy spell and she needs to lay down. The bar in the middle of the bench would prevent her from doing so, and it would prevent anyone from doing so. So not just a pregnant lady and not just the homeless population. This is a map of Pittsburgh, and it shows the disparity between 2019 and 2020. So you can see that there's been an increase in both density and displacement. So you're seeing a lot of people get moved around. And this is in part due to anti-homeless architecture. So what even is this? Sorry, excuse me. This is the breakdown of what homelessness is. So you can see that we're seeing a lot of mental illness, and there's an increase in 2019 to 2020. This has to do with COVID predominantly, but there's also a multitude of other factors. There's hyperinflation, there's the effects of capitalism, there's the effects of the job market, the housing market. It could be anything, which brings us again back to homelessness is not always homelessness. But how are we displacing these people? How are the jobs displacing them? It's through this architecture in part. And what this architecture is labeled as gentrification. So when we see an area that's recently been gentrified, you're going to see a lot of anti-homeless architecture, but this is going to be predominantly hostile architecture. So what hostile architecture is the direct prohibiting usage of such items. So here you can see a windowsill with spikes on it. And this is direct because you're unable to sit on it. It will physically hurt you. Those are actual spikes. Those are not just metal looking pieces. So it's prohibiting the use of sitting or laying on that windowsill, which would provide cover. Maybe someone didn't get into the day shelter because they only do let 20 to 50 people in per night. So you need to seek shelter elsewhere, which is why you're going to see the homeless people in the park or looking for a bench, but they can't sleep on this bench. There's a bar in the middle of it. So they would go to this windowsill, but they can't sleep on this windowsill because there's spikes on it. So where would they go? They're displaced. The other way that, besides direct, the other way that we're marginalizing homeless population is through indirect. So this can be a sign, it can be a weapon-free zone, or it could be a camera. When you see cameras, you usually think that people don't trust other people. Who is this population is traditionally the homeless population. So you see this no loitering sign here. This is from the Mexican War Streets on the north side, for those of you who know. And in this area, there are 3 hospitals that are attempting to gentrify the entire surrounding area, and they're using this indirect anti-homeless architecture to do so. And looking at Pittsburgh, I did take all these pictures, so I don't have to give credit, but this bench is in Steel Plaza, and for those of you who know, that's the T station. And those are 4 bars presenting as an armrest. It's not actually an armrest, but what that is doing is it prevents a homeless person, a pregnant lady, anyone who needs to lay down for whatever reason. It could be a medical, it could just be they're tired, they had a long day, and they want to lay down. But these bars are preventing them from doing so. So this is what we would consider hostile anti-homeless architecture. Now, yes, this is a trash can before you ask. So the reason why this trash can is anti-homeless is, as you can see, the rain cover is on top. So that is to stop rain from getting in because we don't want our trash to be wet for whatever reason. But what it actually is it prevents anyone from reaching their arm down inside and grabbing the trash can. Now, to you and I, this seems like, why would you even want to? But that's because we have the next meal. We have our next meal. We know where we're going to get it from. We can go to bed at night, but the homeless people, the homeless population does not know that. So they have to find their next meal, but we're preventing them from doing so using this trash can. You're unable to reach in. And then also you can see above the Pittsburgh logo, there's a little yellow bag. They lowered the can so that way the trash doesn't rise up as much. So it's even harder to reach. And then this impacts more than just the homeless population. This also impacts the people that need to clean up the streets. So the trash can will fill up faster. It will create hazardous waste that pours over onto the streets. And the homeless people are unable to get their next meal. Moving on, you can see the spikes again. Yes, this is the same picture, and you'll find out why in a second. These are pig ears. This is anti-skate architecture. This is not to be confused with anti-homeless. This is to prevent a skateboard from grinding essentially across the rail, and those are affixed metal balls. You're unable to move them, but this is not to get confused. So here you can see the blend between both anti-skate and anti-homeless architecture. The slant right there on the left is to prevent sitting and laying down. It's supposed to be called the slanted seat. This prevents like faster cycles of moving. So what that does is like, you're not going to want to, I guess, lean up across the slant for as long as you would want to sit down. And then you can see the spikes on the flat bench. Those are called pig ears. And that is anti-skate as well as anti-homeless because you're unable to sit down and lay down on that bench. Now, again, I know it looks like another silly picture. This is a rail. But what this rail is doing is it's preventing anyone from sitting or laying down underneath this canopy. So this is at Steel Plaza. And there's a nice little roof on top. So again, if you didn't get into that day shelter because they only let 25 people in, and we have a lack of homeless shelters, you would want to go to this place. You want to go to Steel Plaza. But you're unable to because of this hostile architecture. So you may be asking, Jason, why did you have to show the picture of the spikes twice? Isn't there so much hostile architecture in Pittsburgh? The answer is no. There is not that much hostile architecture in Pittsburgh. But what there is the modernization of this hostile architecture. So what this is this bench. Again, another silly picture. It's just a zigzag bench. Jason, what are you talking about? I'll tell you. It is an anti-homeless bench. Now, this is non-hostile, but it is anti-homeless. It serves the same purpose. So it's not necessarily hostile. This bench is unable to provide for one person to lay down at any point in the bench. They're specifically made these zigzags so that way you can only sit down with one or two parties. I'm sorry, one or two people, but it will fit multiple parties. So instead of making a long straight bench for someone to lay down on and provide cover, because as you can see, there are trees for canopy and shelter, they actually made it unable for anyone to lay down on. The Pittsburgh Cultural Trust. They are the leading gentrification, I guess, nonprofit organization, you could say. Their About Us page has a section where they say that they're turning the CD, and this is their quote, the CD red light district of Pittsburgh into a prosperous one that businesses would want to invest in. So right there, they explicitly state that they're gentrifying the area. But the Pittsburgh Cultural Trust goes further than that. They make public art installations and they install them in the public area in negative space where homeless people would want to spend the night. They want to go and reside there because maybe they didn't get into the day shelter or they just need a place to stay. So the Pittsburgh Cultural Trust has been taking this negative space, turning it into art installations with like millions and millions of dollars of taxpayer dollars and corporate donors. One corporate donor is the United States Steel. Many of us know this is a local corporation. And what they're doing is they're directly providing money to them to gentrify the area. And I'm able to tell this because of the Dietrich Foundation. Now, what the Dietrich Foundation is, many of you know the name, it's familiar. Mr. Dietrich was on the executive board of US Steel and also directly works with the Pittsburgh Cultural Trust. So I have images of the United States Steel giving direct money to the Pittsburgh Cultural Trust in order to fund these art installations. But enough about hearing about these art installations. Let's take a look at them. So this is the Agnes R. Katz Plaza. What you're looking at here is the back of an eyeball. So I know it sounds really weird, but this is a bench, and this is an anti-sleep bench. So what this bench is only able to fit one party, and you can't even lay down across it. So it turns into an anti-sleep bench. This is a $4 million art installation. Again, this is a nonprofit organization, but they are worth $50 million. So they are getting this money from corporations, donations, and taxpayer dollars. So this is an eyeball and a 22-foot tall bronze waterfall with heated water. So they always try and add like a little bit of pretentiousness into their architecture. So here is the heated water that they do not allow the homeless people to use, even though it should be a basic necessity because this is public art. But the public does not include the homeless in this situation, but it should. And that is my argument. This is the water cube. Again, the pretentious aspect of this is it is the first sparkling water fountain in the world. Yes, you heard that correct, sparkling water. Currently, because the weather outside is very cold and us general population would not want to get water, it is closed to the general public. But who would want to get water during this time? Who doesn't have access to this water? The homeless population. So the homeless population is not able to get water. They're not able to sit on this anti-sleep bench. It only fits 2 people maximum, and it has those affixed metal arms, so you can't lay down across it. So this entire art installation for the public is only geared towards the public that has a house, not the unhoused. So, yeah, so the Pittsburgh Cultural Trust has been installing a lot of this art to deter them, and that's why we're not seeing a lot of homeless population because they're being displaced through this architecture. And on top of that, they're also using corporate dollars to, I guess, essentially gentrify the area. And then this will bring us to the Q&A section. And this is also a QR code to my research paper in case you want to read it. Thank you for listening.
Any questions? Want to kick it off? Anyone have any?
Yeah.
So in Oakland, there was a large area that used to be a green space. I'm not sure if you're aware of it, behind School of Law.
Okay.
And it got turned into a public art exhibit. It's a digital art exhibit. A lot of light, a lot of sound comes out of that area. I was wondering how that factors into this, the use of light and sound to kind of deter people from going places as well.
You know, that's a really good question. I'm not too sure, only because I'm like new to the area. So I haven't done a lot of exploring. Most of my work is in the Mexican war streets and the north side. But I will have to take a look into that. But I'm assuming because they're installing lights and they're installing sounds, it is going to deter a lot of homeless population. They're considered like the unwanted when they're doing this urban planning. Unfortunately, that's not my term. But that's a great question. So I will have to check that out. And you said it's in Oakland?
It's in Oakland. It's right by the Five Guys window.
Okay, yeah, I'll definitely, I think I know exactly what you're talking about. I'll have to go look at that. Thank you for bringing that to my attention. Any other questions? Yeah.
Thank you. This may be an unfair question, because I know you're a transfer student recently moved.
Go ahead.
You know, what extent does our campus here?
That's a great question. So I was looking around our campus because once you see one anti-sleep bench, you notice them all. When I'm here, I'm not seeing a lot of anti-homeless architecture, but I can tell the difference between an old bench and a new bench. A lot of the old benches are anti-homeless because they have that arm bar right in the middle. They're separating the parties, but all the new benches are very welcoming. That's not to say that they're not hostile and anti-homeless, but they are essentially pro-homelessness. So we could sleep on the bench if we so desired to. Thankfully, I have my dorm, but not everyone does. So our campus does have a little bit of both, but that's a great question. Anything else?
Oh, I just wanted to mention, because I'm from Pittsburgh, so like I can remember when a lot of those benches still existed.
Mhm.
And I'm older too, so but I remember like beforehand we used to have bus shelters, and they're very uncommon now, except like on Pitt's campus. They're very spread out. I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with Pitt's campus, but they're very spread out, and they've also kind of like adopted that whole like putting armrests in benches. But we used to have bus shelters, but because so many like homeless persons were using them to kind of like get out of like cold weather or like random rainstorms, they kind of got rid of them over time. I think there's one actual like original one remaining. It's at the intersection of Center and South Makeley, down by the Market District on the east side, if you want to check it out.
Yeah.
because I think that that would probably be good to just include. It's yellow. It has like the original like wooden bench. If you want to check it out.
Yeah, definitely. So just to piggyback on that, I didn't include any of that, but every bus station has a traditionally now smaller bench, so it only fits 2 people with the arm bar in the middle still. So when you go and you're trying to get on the Port Authority bus, make sure you turn around, look at the bench. You'll see it on the ground. It is clearly anti-homeless. I should have put it in this presentation, but I figured that everyone would be able to tell after I presented to them. So there is really no solution to this issue besides getting rid of this architecture, but I do want everyone to like take note of this architecture. So just when you're going on the bus, look at that bench and just remember that it is there to marginalize a certain population. I believe there was one more question.
Yeah, I also have a comment. I've lived in Pittsburgh my whole life too, and
Okay.
obviously I've noticed, the things that change, and they're putting bike lanes in instead of like accommodating other people that literally don't have a house. That still is going on. But there is actually a wall full of plaques commemorating and like honoring the homeless people that have passed away in Pittsburgh. It's under one of the bridges by, it's on Grant Street when you're merging on, like going towards the Fort Pitt Bridge, like on that weird rampway. I don't remember the street that it's on, but there's a whole wall full of plaques that commemorate and honor the homeless people that have passed away.
Yeah, it's truly unfortunate. I mean, that's what happens when you marginalize a population that's that big and desperately needs help, because you saw the graph, the different reasons why people are homeless. You have substance abuse, trauma, mental illness. It could be anything. So of course there's going to be unfortunate deaths, and I'm here to fix that, or at least alleviate as much as possible.
I guess my point was, I think it's really interesting that the city recognizes these people and puts a name to their face and spends money on plaques. And I think it's a great thing that they honor them and recognize their struggle. But in comparison with your presentation, I think it's interesting they still continuously perpetuate the homelessness cycle and don't put that money towards other things and consciously choose to make benches and bus shelters and other things that harm them. So
Right.
I guess that's where I was going.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. Okay, anything else?
Okay.
Thank you, guys.
I think it's the second one, right? I don't think it would just be this.
All right, thank you very much, Jason. So next up, we are going to hear from Odile Enslen, and she's going to present to us on suicide rates and trends in Allegheny County from 2010 to 2019. Come on up.
Sorry, just give me 1 second. Take your time. All right, hi everyone. Like Dr. Zuberi said, my name is Odile Enslen, and I am a graduate student here at Duquesne in the Forensic Science and Law program. So I'm one of those weird majors here today. So my research that I'll be talking about today is looking at the potential relationship between suicide rates and trends and locational poverty here in Allegheny County during the time span of 2010 through 2019. Now, I do want to forewarn that throughout this presentation, there will be a mention of suicide and a brief description of some suicide methods. So just a heads up. So to start off, I do want to define a few key terms within this research, just because these terms aren't defined the same way throughout studies. So when talking about suicide, I'm defining it as someone who takes their own life, and then the rates and trends describe these cases. So suicide rates can be the number of people who are committing suicide within a specific location. So in this example, Allegheny County. And then the suicide trends are going to look at phenomenons that are happening within these cases. So the percent of cases that are white males, that would be an example. And then poverty here, there's multiple ways to define poverty. And so as you can see, poverty threshold versus poverty guideline, you're probably thinking, what are these terms? So when we think about poverty, most of us are probably going to start thinking about the federal poverty line, and that's also known as the poverty guideline. They're trying to switch from one phrase to the other. But this is a value that allows organizations to see if people can qualify for food stamps and other resources. While the poverty threshold, which is the way that I'll be defining my poverty value here, is calculated by the Census Bureau, and it's used for statistical analysis only. So that's how I'm going to be defining it within my research. So to get this poverty threshold, what the Census Bureau does is they use all these different income revenues for a family. And this is going to also account for the family composition and size. So what they do is they take all this into consideration and they calculate a family's income value. What they do is they take this value and they compare it to a year's poverty threshold. So for myself, I'm a single person under the age of 65. So if I made more than $13,465 in 2020, I would be considered not in poverty. If I made lower than that, then I would be considered in poverty. So that's how, within this research, that's what I'll be defining poverty as. So when talking about the data and where it's coming from, the suicide cases are coming from the medical examiner's office here in Allegheny County. And the data that we're receiving for this is information about sex, age, race, municipality location, as well as the cause and manner of death for these cases. And then on the poverty side, we have data that has already been collected by the Census Bureau. So this is data that they've already collected through their surveys. And so there's two ways that the Census Bureau typically collects data. They use the centennial census that we all know happens every 10 years. But then they also have the American Community Survey, or the ACS. So this allows us to look at other information that isn't included in this 10-year census. So apart from the ACS, they do different time estimates. So they do a 1 year, a 3 year, and a 5 year estimate for the ACS. And so when looking at such a small population, such as municipalities where populations can range from Pittsburgh having a couple 100,000 to some that only have 3,000, the 5 year estimate really accompanied for this small population, and it gave the best results for that. So when we look at the literature and we try to see, has this been done? Has anyone looked at just poverty and suicide rates? There isn't much out there, especially the way that I'm defining it. So looking closer at home, so at Allegheny County, they did do a suicide report in 2016, and they looked at cases from 2002 through 2014. So kind of what I'm doing. And they looked at rates and trends. So figure 3 and figure 4 show the rates and trends that they found within those cases. So figure 3, what we can take from that, and let me see if, all right. So this line right here that's above all the rest, that is the white male population. So as you can tell that they have the highest suicide rates, at least in Allegheny County. And then in figure 4, what we can tell from this, so each bar represents a different method. So this brown bar right here represents asphyxiation. So what we can gather from this is the phenomenon that asphyxiation is more frequently used within the younger population than the older population. But when we start talking about poverty, this report doesn't really talk about it at all. The closest that they ever get to poverty, in a way, is talking about the number of, well, the percentage of suicide victims that use different resources such as child welfare, assisted housing, public welfare, things of that nature. But this is a horrible way of even describing if this is poverty. So that's where the lack of knowledge is. But because I'm a forensic science major, I'm more interested in other questions, but for the sake of this presentation, I really want to focus on the question, are there higher suicide rates within impoverished communities? So within the 130 municipalities in Allegheny County, and taking in the income threshold from the Census Bureau and the suicide cases from the Allegheny County Medical Examiner's Office, Allegheny County is kind of an ideal place, and I'll explain why I think that is. So when we look at the range of percent of people in poverty, it ranges from 0.3% all the way up to 60. So even though we may have municipalities that neighbor each other, they might have drastically different poverty rates. And then within my time frame of 2010 through 2019, there were a total of 1,914 suicide cases. So this is an ongoing public health issue in our community. So the data that I'm going to be talking about is preliminary. We had to send some cases back just to get more information. So this is just encompassing around 1,600 cases. But for the simplicity of this, I picked 5 neighboring municipalities just to show you that even if they are neighboring, they can be different. So the 5 that I chose was Trafford, North Versailles, Wall, East McKeesport, and Wilmington. And so in this graph, what you can see is the percent of people living in poverty. And so because I'm using a 2010 and a 2015 ACS, I split it up so that you can see the increase, decrease, or if they stayed the same. So Trafford is this line right here that has a really big spike in poverty. So they went from a little bit under 20% to up to 60%. So they had the most dramatic increase, while the rest of them kind of increased by 2 to 3%. The only one that did decrease was Wall, and they decreased by 1% from 18 to 17%. So my hypothesis was that obviously suicide rates would be correlated to poverty rates. So I thought, oh, Trafford had the most dramatic increase. They're going to have the most dramatic increase in suicide rates as well. That's not what we saw at all, and which I was surprised. So as you can see, Trafford actually had 0 suicide cases within the time frame that I'm looking at. But then Wall, who had that 1% decrease, even though it was a 1% decrease, they had a 2.57% increase in suicide rates per 1,000. So even though I thought that there would be a correlation between the two, that's not what the data is telling us, but we can still pull information from this. So my correlation coefficient between the suicide rates and poverty percent was 0.17, which is a very weak positive correlation, but we can still gather information from this graph. So as you can see, all these little blue dots represent a case. And so what we can see in this graph is that the majority of the cases are actually clustering towards the lower end of poverty percentage, which I think is interesting just because it really disproved my hypothesis. So the main reason why I'm even talking about this and really focused on this for my research is because when we look at resources for the impoverished community, there's food stamps, there's Medicaid, there's all sorts of things out there for them. But then when we look on the suicide aspect of it, there's hotlines, lifelines, therapy, nonprofits that do amazing work for resources for this community. But what about the middle? So with just a quick Google search, you can see that there's really nothing out there that focuses on the impoverished community and mental health issues. And if you even take a more narrow approach, Allegheny doesn't have anything as well. So that's really where I'd love to help bridge the gap. And even though my data doesn't show that there is this high correlation between suicide rates and poverty, we can still get the resources that we need for those different areas within Allegheny County. So I just want to thank Dr. Zuberi, Dr. Ferrara, and Mandy Tinky for being on my committee, just because they've helped me along the way with gathering data and everything else along the way as well. And I will take any questions if anyone has any. Yes.
I might have missed it, but with the percentages that we're talking about.
Yeah.
On your graphs, were you calculating the percent based off of like the population number, or was it
Yes.
just, okay.
Yeah. So what the Census Bureau does is that they have an estimate for population, and then they have an estimate for people living in poverty. So what I did is I basically took the two numbers and I divided them to get a percentage.
Okay, that makes sense. So I was gonna say Trafford is like huge compared to some of the other places.
Oh yeah, and plus Pittsburgh, like the city of Pittsburgh itself is a municipality, and that itself has like a bunch of a huge population as well. So yeah, I did account for population.
Hi, I was wondering if suicide
in Allegheny County Jail is counted towards the county number of total suicides?
So that's actually an interesting question. I have asked that question. So Mandy Tinky, which I thanked in this presentation, she currently is the person that's helping me from the medical examiner's office. I don't know how she does it, but she is so busy with so many other research and doing 2 jobs currently. So that's a question that I've asked her and I still have yet to get a response from, but I will definitely give you the answer once I have it.
Any other questions? Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I would say keep it on just because we technically,
No,
I think we're technically in violation of like the social distance spacing.
All right, yeah, well, if you can't, just do that then. A little soft buttons.
Also, you can always just like talk directly into the microphone and it'll just capture it and we can also watch it back.
All right, I know we went through a change period, so we've had some shuffling, but we're gonna continue on. Up next is Emma Patton, and she's gonna talk to us about checking your privilege, the effects of intersectionality on the Pittsburgh community. So thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name's Emma Patton, and I'm a junior biology major here in the Bair School of Natural and Environmental Sciences. Some of you might be wondering, why is a biology pre-med major standing up here talking about intersectionality in the Pittsburgh area? But as a hopeful future doctor, something that I really want to incorporate in my work is the social justice aspect that goes along with healthcare and looking at the person as a holistic body instead of just the symptoms that they're presenting. So to start off, I will be presenting Checking Your Privilege, a study on the effects of intersectionality on the Pittsburgh community. My work has been inspired by the work that I do with the Community Engaged Scholars Program here at Duquesne. So first, I just want to break down my research a little bit. I'll be starting off with giving you guys a little bit of background on intersectionality, Kimberly Crenshaw, and the effects of some nonprofits. I will then move into socioeconomic ties with intersectionality, specifically some Pittsburgh-based effects that we have. Then we will move into community outreach effects, and I will talk about a couple nonprofit organizations specifically here in the Pittsburgh area. And finally, I will conclude with my findings and some long-term effects for research. So first, like I said, we will be starting with background information that I have found. And to start, I would like to define intersectionality for those of you who might not be aware. Intersectionality is the idea that we are using multiple dimensions and modalities of social reform to look at people's disadvantages. It also is based on the fact that we are not defining people by one single status, such as socioeconomic status or race, but we are looking at them as a multi-dimensional complex, and we are able to discover them and the disadvantages that they face with no predetermined ideas, because in the end, each person experiences these disadvantages individually in their own experience. So I would not be doing this presentation justice if I did not mention Kimberly Crenshaw. She is a fantastic woman. She is one of the most prominent Black feminists of our time. And she started kind of sharing her message around 1990. And currently she is a law professor at UCLA in Columbia, but she is also a leading authority in civil rights and Black feminism. Kimberly Crenshaw has provided a method for locating oneself at the intersection of multiple discrete identities or modes of oppression. So basically, she is allowing us to have a way to account for one's unique individual experiences. And this is basically what the term intersectionality is looking for us to understand and realize whenever we are talking to people about their disadvantages. Next, I would like to talk about some concerns that we see here in Pittsburgh that could be considered disadvantages. So here in Pittsburgh, we have 192,000 people who are just above the poverty line. And besides that, 1 in 8 residents are residing below the poverty line. So that has become the basis for my research, which will be low socioeconomic status. And for those of you who don't know, low socioeconomic status refers to those who are either around the poverty line or below the poverty line. And for my research, I knew that there was a lot of low socioeconomic status in Pittsburgh. So I wanted to have that be our key disadvantage and then show the effects of other compounding disadvantages. So to start, some of these compounding disadvantages include poverty. Poverty has been found that this isn't something that just happens by chance. In recent studies, we have found that there are common populations that this mostly happens in. And these include children, the elderly, female-headed households, people of color, and more. Something interesting about this that I will show you a little bit later is that these are some of our most primary populations here in Pittsburgh. Next, I would like to touch on some violence and crime that we have here in Pittsburgh. Over the past few years, we have had a consistent rise in crime in the Pittsburgh area, specifically in areas with low-income households. It has also been found to be disproportionately related to certain races, ages, and religions. Finally, the Pittsburgh Public Schools ranks at the bottom 50% in education in Pennsylvania. This has led to a lot of students and even adults needing supplemental support for education and providing a lot of problems in the long-term future for just even being able to do things like fill out a tax return or properly read a book and be able to understand it. And the Pittsburgh Public Schools is not able to provide the proper education that they need. Next, I want to talk about community resources because these are crucial in intersectionality and kind of trying to combat those effects a little bit. So the community resources I will be talking about are nonprofits. Nonprofits are really unique organizations in that they rely completely on funding from outside donors or grants. And so to keep their doors open, to be successful, to get these grants, they need a couple key points to be successful. The first is location. If the nonprofit is placed in a location that is either A, too far for those who need the resources to get to, or B, it's in a location that that community doesn't really need it, it's not going to be able to do its job and support those people. For example, we have a lot of Pittsburgh hospitals, obviously here in the downtown area. But recently, there has been a lot of findings that those people in the suburbs, even those who are in moderate socioeconomic statuses, are having trouble getting access to healthcare because we have centralized so much of our healthcare here in Pittsburgh in the city and not enough in the suburbs. AGH is working on this and have expanded a lot of their hospitals and are starting to expand into the suburbs. But again, it's still something that needs to be worked on. Next, we have transformational relationships. Transformational relationships are defined as one that is not like a transaction where you are giving something and they are getting something. It's more we are learning about these people and learning about them as a person in their story instead of defining them as what they need from you. Next, we obviously need to make sure we have the correct teaching so that these individuals can learn how to better work with their disadvantages, and they're probably going to need resources for that too. Finally, we need to make sure that these nonprofits are providing what is truly needed. Sometimes nonprofits will go into a community and think they know what the community needs, but in reality, the community actually needs something else, and no one's given them an opportunity to speak up and say, this is what we actually need. So like I said, the biggest concern for nonprofits right now is funding. They rely solely on grants and private donors to complete their work and pay their staff, and without this, they have to shut down their doors. Now I would like to move on into my next section where I will be talking about socioeconomic ties with intersectionality. So first, I'm going to show some statistics about socioeconomics in the Pittsburgh area that we can then relate to some compounding effects. The Pittsburgh area is made up of about 300,000 population-wise, and our average income is $54,000, which is $12,000 below the average national income. This makes it really difficult for, obviously, people to stay above the poverty line along with the cost of living. One other thing I wanted to mention on this slide was wage gap is always something that people are kind of asking about. And we do have a pretty decent sized one here in Pittsburgh. Men make 1.3 times more than women in the same position in the same location in Pittsburgh. Now, when talking about this, it's really important to make sure that we consider race because disadvantages are found to be most common in minority groups. So as I'm showing here, 63% of the Pittsburgh population is white and 24% is of Black population and 6% is of Asian population. This defines Black and Asian populations as our minority populations, which we see a lot of disadvantages in. Now, this is a really important figure that I have here because this is talking about the regions of each part of Pittsburgh and how they break down their average income. So as we get darker in color, our average income increases. And one area I want to point out is the way this area right here juxtaposes itself completely. So we have the lowest income area, one of the lowest income areas in Pittsburgh, this is around like the city area. And then on the outskirts here, we have some of the highest income areas. So I just think that's interesting because it's not always about our location, but it's important to break that down and understand that by looking at our disadvantages. So now I'm going to move into those compounding effects that we want to look at on top of low socioeconomic status. So the first being race. We talked about this before. A lot of people who are of different races have trouble finding their place in communities where they might be the minority. So it can cause a lot of feelings of separation and loneliness, which can lead to mental illness, which I will talk about later. Along with this, a lot of minority races are found to be stuck in this generational poverty that is really, really hard to get out of. And that is one of the biggest disadvantages on top of low socioeconomic status. Next, we already talked about the gender wage gap, which is terrible, obviously. But we also have a pretty unequal demographic with women and men. So women the ages of 18 to 24 were found to be the lowest income demographic here in the Pittsburgh area. And we also mentioned previously that women-headed households are part of those disadvantages that are more likely to have low income. So that just goes right along with that. Again, we mentioned violence, but it's also important to mention trauma. Trauma is something that can kind of spring off of the violence that people are experiencing. And what we're finding is that something called generational trauma is a really real thing. And as these families go through these traumatic experiences, whether that's crime or domestic violence, there are their kids seeing it and they might pass it down, and the trauma itself continues to get carried down. And finally, there's mental illness. Mental illness can be either a pre-existing disadvantage or it can be a disadvantage that is based off of any of these three, and there are many more. So mental illness is another one to be careful with because this disadvantage can be really hard to deal with unless you properly approach it. So we definitely need some more resources to approach that. My next section I would like to move into is I would like to look at nonprofits as an outreach tactic to slow the effects of intersectionality. First, I'm going to start by talking about ACH Clear Pathways. As a community engaged scholar here at Duquesne, I have been placed with a nonprofit organization, and this is the one that I've been placed with, and I work as an intern there. So I've seen a lot about this organization, and I've gotten to learn a lot about how it kind of started. And I think that's important to the ways that nonprofits can help the community. So first I want to share a little bit of Tyan's story. Tyan Battle is the founder of ACH Clear Pathways. And in 2009, Tyan's son, Amonsi Harris, passed away from the undiagnosed congenital heart disease. Tyan was a woman who grew up in the Hill District, had low socioeconomic status, and couldn't always give Eamon everything that she wanted to. He was really interested in the arts and specifically martial arts, and that was just something that she could provide for him. But once he passed away, she felt an immense amount of guilt about that, and she decided to take a leap of faith and start ACH. And ACH is a community for underprivileged youth to learn about the arts and even express their emotions and their trauma through that. So she started with grassroots fundraising, and she decided to apply for the 501c3 application, which was approved 6 months later on Mother's Day. They received a $25,000 grant from the Heinz Endowment, and Tyann now is extremely involved in ACH. Besides her corporate role, she is also always down with the kids and creating personal relationships with them. Some other Pittsburgh organizations, we have Macedonia Face and we have Arise. Macedonia Face deals with disparities in African-American communities, and Arise helps with immigrants and refugees to find their place in a new environment. And this is really important because here in Pittsburgh, we have 13% foreign-born individuals. So Arise has done a lot to support them. Finally, I just want to talk about the effects these nonprofits have had specifically in Pittsburgh. They are able to go beyond surface level, make individual relationships. They can provide a little bit more unbiased support since they are not anchored down by taxpayer money all the time. And they can also provide that tailored support, making sure that each person is actually getting what they need. To conclude, I would just like to share that through the mentioned compounding effects, we can see that low socioeconomic status in Pittsburgh is one of our main problems that we're dealing with. And through all these other disadvantages, we have even more trouble kind of navigating these. So there's a lot of work to be done, and we need to establish more strong data and funding for organizations to be able to tackle this. And quickly, I'm just going to share one of these because I don't want to go over my time. In healthcare, actually in the Pittsburgh community, the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center did a research study on the effects of transplant rates in different races. And they found that those of minority races were least likely to get a transplant, and that was due to not signing the consent form. But their research never concluded why they weren't signing it. So I think it's really important here to approach education. Are they uneducated? Do they not know what they're signing? So there's a lot that can go into that. And there's a couple other approaches that I think we could take, but I want to thank you all for coming today. And I want to thank my sponsors as well. Does anybody have any questions?
Any questions, comments? I really appreciated your presentation. It just like, especially including ACH, because I actually worked with Heinz Endowments, and that's what led to other community funding like being allocated. And they created like a transformative arts grant specifically for those like that were helping quote unquote like distressed communities, specifically those who were like Black and Brown, or anyone who was like impoverished, actually get access to arts funding if they want to just start their own programming, stuff like that. So I really do appreciate it. And this was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
I can add just really quick too. I really appreciate that you brought up the challenges that nonprofits face in terms of funding, because I think that it's very real, and it gets like the amount of time and effort that has to go into getting funding to create a stable environment, to create a stable nonprofit is a lot, and it takes away from the ability to actually do what the original mission is. And I don't think we pay a lot of attention to that. It's one of the reasons why nonprofits become so unstable. And so I think that was really great that you highlighted that.
Thank you. Yeah, it's honestly something that I knew it was a piece of it because I do work with donor relations at ACH. So obviously, like I was a little bit aware, but I did get all of my information about Tyann. I did a direct interview with her, and she kind of explained like the whole process. And she was lucky she had someone who was able to work as a mentor for her, who was her grant writer. And getting a grant writer can be very expensive. And so she kind of lucked out on that, and like they kind of pushed her. And she tells me all the time, okay, I'm in my office, I'm writing a grant. Okay, I'm writing another grant. And so it's like an ongoing problem that they have to continue to keep up with.
Thank you. So, and last but not least, we have our group We have Sarah Babcock, Katie Burch, and Megan Wetherington, all here to talk to us about the Elsinore Bennu think tank.
Hello, everyone. We are first-year public history master students at Duquesne University in the Department of History. This project was developed in our graduate level oral history methodology and practice course under the direction of Dr. Jennifer Whitmer-Taylor. And our project is titled the Elsinore Bennu Think Tank for Restorative Justice and Oral History. I'm Katie Burch, this is Megan Wetherington and Sarah Babcock. And then I'm going to start by introducing the organization we're partnering with on this project, the Elsinore Bennu Think Tank for Restorative Justice. So the founders of the think tank consisted of Duquesne sociology professor, Dr. Norm Conti, 6 incarcerated students, and students from Duquesne University. These students work to lessen the stigma of incarceration within their class meetings by referring to themselves as either inside students or outside students. Think tank members have created an inclusive environment to further educate themselves and others by fostering open communication. Now I'd like to explain a few of the ongoing projects that the EBTT is involved in, many of which are topics of interest. The think tank focuses on barriers to successful reentry and other restorative and social justice issues. They have used their lived experience of prison isolation to help elderly communities during quarantine, including delivering meals. They are now working to create their house of life, which is going to serve as a physical base of operations and as a home for members and other returning citizens. They also host community chess nights for returned citizens and students at Duquesne University. This event started when a returned citizen, Charlie Lewis, taught a Duquesne student and think tank member, Dee Hube, to play chess, and the event blossomed from there. I also want to point out that chess nights happen in room 109 of the Student Union at Duquesne University every first and third Tuesday from 7 to 9 p.m. And you can also use the QR code on the presentation to access information on the chess nights. And then on the right, we have included the cover of a book written by the 6 original members of the think tank from inside the state correctional institution in Pittsburgh. Their book is called Life Sentences, Writings from Inside an American Prison. This book is authored by the EBTT and specifically includes the writing of authors Robert Farouk Weidman, James Fly Martin, Richard Khalifa Diggs, Ralph Malachi Bolden, Oscar Brown, and Clarence Sean Robinson. As part of our interview preparation, we researched these efforts in many of the writings of the think tank members in order to understand their motivations and better capture their stories in our interviews.
All right, so I'm going to talk with you all about some of our project goals and our dissemination goals. So first and foremost, we wanted to focus on producing. So the goal of this project is to produce 13 interviews, which are going to highlight the experiences, the insights, and just the overall stories of our think tank members. So this is really critical in concerning the scope of our course, because we are only going to December with this class, but this project will continue on after us. So Sarah's going to talk a little bit more on the long-term effects of that. So next, we're going to focus on targeting. So who is our target audience? That is going to be a specific emphasis on the young people of Pittsburgh. This is because many of the think tank members were incarcerated when they were young. So that's something that's close to their heart, and we want to emphasize that, as well as other think tank members that we've spoken with either face-to-face or via Zoom, such as Big Lou or Louis Alexander. Alexander Lewis, because I'm nervous. Here we go. All right, and then next we're going to talk about creating. So we want to create useful material for the immediate and the long-term goals of the think tank. This comes into effect in a lot of ways. So we have this picture here. This is a task hand. This is this is a voice recording device, which we have in our oral history lab, and we use those to record our interviews. So we will be using voice recordings, we'll be using videos. We'll also hopefully be creating a physical exhibit and an online exhibit. We're still discussing different dissemination methods, but hopefully it'll be housed in Gumber. And then finally, we'll also have transcripts, which will be housed in Gumber in our oral history space. Then finally on this slide, we want to reflect. So throughout this entire process, we're really hoping to reflect the generosity, the graciousness, and just the wisdom of all our think tank members, as well as focusing on just interrogating those biases that are very much associated with returned citizens. All right. And here we have our concepts of co-ownership and shared authority. So these two terms have been foundational in all of our public history coursework that we've been taking. However, this class and all our interviewers are both public history and traditional history. So this is a co-effort. So these two terms are also very critical within this project. So the goal is to create a collaborative space with the think tank that will meet their goals. We also have done this by placing a specific emphasis on that partnership between the narrator and the interviewer in order to maintain that authenticity of their stories. We've done this in a couple of different ways. So one of the most exciting and fun ways is just speaking with the members of the think tank and meeting them in person, breaking bread with them, as well as Zooming with them and just hearing their ideas and what they want the goals of this project to be and what they want to accomplish. Another way is the creation of a release board, which will allow the interviewers to use their interviews for the duration of their lifetimes in any way they please. So that's,
yeah. So Megan explained some of the immediate goals of our dissemination at the end of this semester, but we do hope that this project will have a much longer life than this one semester. On the screen, we've got a couple of other envisioned uses that we're hoping to accomplish. The first one is that we hope to achieve an academic audience with these interviews. We would love if scholars of restorative justice and mass incarceration were able to use the stories that we're recording in their work. One of the ways we're hoping to achieve this is by continuing to present this project at professional conferences, hopefully Oral History in the Mid-Atlantic region next year and the Oral History Association to sort of expand the audience for our work. The other audience we want to achieve is a non-academic one. In conversation with some think tank members, one of them suggested that this project could be considered a roadmap for other restorative justice activists. We were all really attached to that idea, and so we are trying to incorporate it. We would love if other activists could look at the work and experience of think tank members and apply it to their own work on the ground. In order to reach both of those audiences, the transcripts and audio interviews will be housed in the care of the Oral History Initiative here at Duquesne University and Gumber Library, and they will be publicly accessible for free online, meaning that anyone and everyone who wants to access them can. The picture on the left is what it looks like when you go to the Oral History Initiative from Gumber website, and then the link on the left is how you find the oral history. So those two listed are the two that you can access now, and eventually one will say EBTT on it. In addition to those two audiences, though, we did, as Megan mentioned, wanted to reach some younger audiences. One of the ideas that we had was that we would love to incorporate oral history into education for younger history learners. We would be really excited about the prospect of middle school and high school history curriculums using oral history in history education. We're hoping to, as part of our final dissemination, create some coursework or some programming that Pittsburgh teachers can incorporate into their classrooms to hear think tank stories. In addition to expanding the audience, though, we do still hope to expand the scope of the presentation. I know Megan mentioned we're only at 13 interviews for this semester, but the three of us and several of our classmates are planning to continue conducting interviews next semester. There are still a bunch of think tank members we won't get to hear from yet, including Dee and Sydney, who are in charge of this wonderful event, that we definitely want to interview because there's a bunch of stories to still be collected about the think tank work. Before we wrap up, we did want to mention that the think tank meets every Friday morning, and we can put you in contact with someone that has that meeting link if y'all are interested in learning more about their work. Oh, and the next 2 afternoons, there are expert panels, and several of our narrators actually serving on those expert panels. So if you want to hear from them firsthand, tune in tomorrow on Friday afternoon or swing back by here. Thanks so much for listening. We'd be happy to answer any questions if you have any. Dr. Simpson.
I don't want to take, if anybody else had a question, I don't want to take anyone's space. So I really am impressed by the scope of the project, in particular the way that you're thinking about the dissemination and use of these. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about how you're looking to make these accessible to high school and middle school audience. It's a really neat way of thinking about telling a really important story about Pittsburgh and changes in Pittsburgh over the long 20th century.
Sure. So we're certainly in early stages as far as dissemination goes. We were thinking something along the lines of developing like a short lesson plan, a short activity. Dr. Taylor in our oral history class led us in a found poetry activity with oral histories, where we got to like use the words of others to create new meaning about the events or to like understand the meaning better. So that would be really cool to incorporate, and it's very entry level. We also though would be really excited about younger history learners getting to do oral histories themselves, be more familiar with the methodology and practice. I know that PHLF did get a grant to do some of that work in local schools, but we would be really excited about somehow trying to incorporate them recording their own oral histories, even if it's just with family members or with each other, to sort of understand the practice.
Yeah, there's another project within our class that with the National Negro Opera House, they're having children in the community go out and perform oral histories. So just incorporating those methods, I think, because I'm sure if any of us had run into oral history much earlier than grad school, it would just be a very different experience in class. And I think that's something that's really important that is very much lacking in our public school system.
Any other questions?
So I'm also in this class. We have big plans for dissemination and for continuing the project. And I was just wondering if you all thought it might be wise for us to look into some sort of grant funding to sustain and maintain the project once we're all gone.
I mean, certainly, yeah. So we talked at least about continuing the next semester, and the three of us are first year, so maybe we'll be here next year too, right? But we would love if the collection kept growing from there as the think tank keeps growing. I think that would certainly need grant funding to sustain, and depending on how extensive our potential programming is, it would certainly help, yeah.
I know that also the think tank does have some grant funding, so they may be able to put some towards that project. That's obviously up to them. But because this project is so centered on the goals of the think tank, it depends on where they want to put finances, but I think it would be a good decision to do that.
I was going to say, I also think it depends on how many projects, like within the overall project, we're actually going to use in dissemination and what we want to do in the future and how grant money can play into that as well. Really just like, how big do we want to make this project or how narrow do we want to make it?
I was just going to ask, could you briefly describe what an oral history is? Like, how long is that interview? How does it work?
Yes, if you guys can. Yeah. So yeah, so we're using the task cams for the most part, although some of ours are on Zoom. So we're just recording the entire Zoom conversation and it'll email you the transcript and the audio. But yeah, they're like an hour to an hour and a half is kind of what we're shooting for. And we are just doing one per narrator for now, although it's not uncommon to do follow-up interviews in the more general practice of oral history.
Yeah, it's a much more it's a much longer process than typically you end up with the dissemination. So it could be anywhere from, you know, that 1 hour to 3 hour mark, because our focus as oral historians is very much to have the narrators lead the interview. Mm-hmm. So wherever they want to go with their story, we have prepared questions that within our research and within those meetings with the think tank, we've kind of created. So we have those baseline questions, but really it's wherever the narrator wants to take their story. So however they are willing to talk to us, we will take it.
It's also important to point out that some of this can be very traumatic for narrators, depending on if they are a returned citizen or what their role is in the think tank. So keeping that in mind as we are doing these interviews this semester and in the future, and how that really plays into oral history methodology, and how sometimes you have to stop an interview and you have to go back because these are personal, sensitive stories from people's lives that really hold a lot of meaning.
You brought up that they keep the rights to the transcript and rights to the interview after it's been done. Is that typical within oral history, or is that something going against the paradigm?
Well, so it's sort of complicated and it depends on the project. We kind of are going to have access to the rights. They sign a consent form that gives us the rights, although there's a release that they can use it, the narrator, for the duration of their life, however they see fit. which isn't necessarily common, and it certainly isn't always the case in oral histories. That's a provision that some other oral history initiative projects have done that we wanted to include as well. It is case-by-case basis, and I think there's a general sort of consensus in the field that more people are willing to leave control of the stories in the hands of narrators, or that co-ownership concept that Megan was talking about.
Yeah, that protection of the narrators, that, to my understanding, is becoming much more common, which I think is a critical point in many different fields across history, anthropology, museums, like just the protection of the groups which we are displaying online. Like they are vulnerable to different attacks, unfortunately, just as we all are whenever we're involved in cyberspace. But it's critical to have those legally spelled out to protect the narrator the best, as well as protecting the institution.
I just wanted to mention, because you were talking about like ways that you guys can get youth involved, and maybe also like expanding the narrations that you do have. I was going to suggest maybe getting involved in local libraries, because again, a lot of returned citizens have to go to libraries to get access to internet. But not only that, there are a lot of kids there, especially kids who might be more receptive to things like that, because maybe like they're slightly older, so they can go based on whenever they want to go. Or again, kids where it's just like they're dealing with circumstances like that. Another group, Amachi, which is actually based nearby, like a couple blocks away from Duquesne. Again, they work with like youth whose parents or guardians have been incarcerated. And that might be like a really good way, because I think Amachi also like works with some of the Pittsburgh public schools too, to kind of get like kids involved. It's kind of like just a forum for kids to just really cope with what's happening, but not only that, like to grow kind of beyond the circumstance. So I think that might be a really good way to bridge these two communities, because again, there's the person who's experiencing it directly as like an incarcerated person or formerly incarcerated person, and then there's, you know, the family aspect. And I think that would really like help with the oral history of it, just like what that feels like to see your loved one in that circumstance.
Yeah, that'd be really great to like create that kind of lesson plan or activity and bring that to them so they could use it.
Yeah,
We'll
thanks for the
definitely-
suggestion. That's
Yeah,
awesome.
that's great. Thank you.
No problem.
All right, in the interest of time, we're
Thank you to those who attended via Zoom. And thank you to everyone who stayed and watched the presentations live. We really do appreciate it. So that concludes this session for today. We do have an afternoon session later on at 1:30. And thank you all for attending. That is it.
congratulations.